of gets to one of the things that I struggle with, and maybe you can offer some insight here. When I try to introduce people, manga fan or non-manga fan alike, getting past that art style is sometimes a jump. Is there one Tezuka title that you tend to go to more to recommend to Americans who may not be as used to that style?
Well, that's something that you often hear. There are a lot of people who have difficulty with a Tezuka style, especially if they're used to a more adult style in graphic novels or comics at all, and they come into Tezuka's work and they feel there's a disconnect between these kind of cute images and the subject matter that people who are not used to comics at all and who have only been reading literature and maybe people in your audience or parents, grandparents, they just don't read comics. Then some of Tezuka's more adult-oriented works, such as Adolf or Buddha or things like that, I think often work very well. And I think actually that's one of the reasons that Buddha has done well in the United States. Not only is there interest in the story itself, but it also among Tezuka's works, it's easier for some people who are not used to comics to delve into the material. But what you say is very true. There are a lot of people who get hung up on that disconnect, and actually it's not just Tezuka. There are a lot of Japanese other manga artists and anime works as well that have this sort of a childlike art style deployed in the use of pursuing really sophisticated themes and sometimes scary themes, and people who are not used to it, it's hard for them. It's tough. They have to work. They got to go to work. We need to make them work. It's good. So your audience, when they're trying to get people interested in anime and manga, they have to tell people you got to work at it a little bit. You can't expect to jump in and get all the pleasure right away.
Absolutely. I think Barefoot Gan, which another title you were involved with the translation, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I was only involved with the actual translation of Volume 2 with my friend Jared Cook, but I've been involved peripherally in the series and in Project Gan itself for a long time.
Well, and also, you put that bit in the back of Manga, didn't you? Wasn't that
That's
the first
correct.
translation of that?
That's correct. Yeah.
Wow. Another example of a title that you'd hand to the average American and they'd say, "What on earth is this?" And then of course they get to the final pages of Volume 1. What on earth is this?
That's right. Yeah. No, people are shocked by Barefoot Gen, and especially the disconnect between the visual imagery and then the subject matter, because for Americans the idea, I think until relatively recently, of using the comic medium to pursue these horrific stories, it's still relatively new. And in the United States, of course, Art Spiegelman did that with Mouse, which some of your audience may be aware of. It won a Pulitzer Prize, and it's about Nazi Germany. But it uses animal characters, so there's an anthropomorphic, they're mice and they're pigs and there's other animals employed to depict what is essentially a terribly adult, scary story. So other people have done it, but the Japanese, I think, have been out in front on this, and actually Art Spiegelman himself was quite influenced, I believe, by not only Barefoot Gen, but what was being done in Japan by other manga artists and some of the Gekiga artists whom you mentioned, such as Tsuge Yoshiharu. And this is just getting into kind of arcane trivia, but actually Art Spiegelman, before he created Mouse, he edited a wonderful magazine devoted to comic art, or comics, C-O-M-I-X kind of comics, called Raw, R-A-W. And it was very much an avant-garde, experimental magazine, a fabulous magazine if you ever get a chance to see it. And he was exploring with a lot of some of these ideas, and there were also some of the Japanese Gekigo works, such as some sequences from Sugeyoshi Haru, who was a contemporary or a competitor of Tezuka, Gekiga artists, were reproduced in raw in the United States, and they were some of the first Japanese manga that were actually reproduced here.
Wow. Yeah, that would have been quite a while ago.
Yeah, it was a long time ago, yeah. It would have been like the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s.
Man. Yeah, now, I mean, I know when I first started getting into all this stuff in the late 90s, and I wanted to read up on it, I went online and I talked to people in real life and said, you know, what can I read on this? And they said, well, there's manga, and that's about it.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. It's actually.
But that was true. Yeah, for a while that was it. Yeah. You're right.
So, you know, what was the impetus for manga, and how the heck did you get it published?
Well, that's an interesting a question, and it goes back to the fact that I had been reading manga and loving them since I'd been a university student in 1970. And actually in the late 70s, I was also in Tokyo, and I had graduated from university, but I was studying translation and interpreting at the same university in Tokyo I had been at in 1970. And I think actually I take that back. I was actually working as a professional translator in Tokyo already. Wow. But I was very much in love with manga, and some friends and I, two Japanese friends, and my friend Jared Cook, we put together this group called Dadakai, which is a pun on the word for dada and the word for association and the word for no good in Japan. And we had this goal of translating manga for non-Japanese because we thought that manga was such a fabulous medium. And Shinji Sakamoto, who was the business manager, quote unquote, of our group, he was instrumental in help permission to translate works like the Phoenix and Eiji Matsumoto's stories. But we were never able to get them published. And the Phoenix, for example, collected dust, literally collected dust for, I think, over 25 years in the States of Tezuka Productions. So we didn't know how to get this stuff published, although that had been one of our original goals. So I came to the conclusion at the end of the 70s that before trying to get translated and get it published, what was really necessary was a book that would introduce manga as a phenomenon to non-Japanese, and that would be the first step, and then that might make it possible later on to get some translations published, because there were a lot of issues revolving around translation, not the least of which were the fact that American publishers had never heard of Japanese manga, and Japanese comics seemed like kind of a oxymoron. It didn't seem like they go together at all. So that was my impetus, and then I had a friend in Tokyo, Peter Goodman, who was working for a Japanese publisher that specialized in books, English language books for the foreign market, for the overseas market. And I was able to interest him in my idea, and that led to manga finally appearing in 1983, published by Kodansha International, which was the overseas branch of one of Japan's largest publishers, and unfortunately they just closed it at the beginning of this year, which was a true tragedy. But that's how it all started. That's a long response to your question, but that's how it all came about.
That's fascinating. And what was the response to manga when it came out?
I think it's interesting. I mean, most people, frankly, had never heard of course, Japanese comics, let alone the word manga. And I actually had not really an argument, but a fairly warm discussion, I should say, with my friend Peter, who was the editor, over how to title the book, because I thought putting manga in the title would be a mistake, because nobody had heard of it, and I was afraid that in library card catalogs, because in those days everything was paper card catalogs, I was afraid that the book would be put in along with manganese. Not, manga, manganese, a rare metal. Or people would think it's an Italian word for eating, like manger or something like that. So I was not in favor of having the word manga in the title, and the original title that I had suggested was Japanese Comics, A New Visual Culture, or something like that.
Ooh, nice.
But Peter said, no, we should use this word. It's good. We should use it. And of course, he was the editor, so editors usually get to have a lot of say on titling of books, and that's what happened. And he was right. It hasn't been an obstacle. But a lot of people, I think, were just amazed. They didn't realize that Japan had this very vibrant comics culture, and then two, I think what made me really happy was that I think a lot of people had this opinion at the time that the Japanese were humorless. They had no sense of humor, and the whole idea of Japanese popular culture didn't really ring a bell with most people. They thought that Japanese were just a bunch of automatons that worked hard, or they were, kamikaze pilots or geisha or something like that. And I think that the book not only was an eye-opener for a lot of people in the sense that it showed them that there was this really rich comics culture, which was bigger than anyone had ever dreamed would be possible anywhere in the world, but they also were just surprised at how complex and interesting and fun Japanese popular culture could be, and that to me was just enormously gratifying to hear from reviewers and readers that they were just that they were surprised to see what was being done in Japan, because that was part of my goal, was to help introduce help people focus on something beyond the traditional kind of geisha, samurai, kamikaze pilot, automaton businessman, salaryman kind of images.
Yeah, and done very well. And one of the things that still amazes me, and like I said, now that I'm kind of flipping through it, is just how visual the book is, and how many examples you have of various bits of manga going back a very long way. It's just stunning how much there is, and how much variety that was packed into this book.
Well, it's wonderful to hear you say that, because of course we live in a much more visual world today, and it's been, it's nearly 30 years now since the book came out. Well, actually, yeah, it's almost 30 years since the book came out. And in those days, it was a much less visual world, so we were lucky that we were able to, incorporate so many images. I was very lucky that the publisher agreed to put so many images in, and nowadays that wouldn't be possible. It's so difficult to get permission to reproduce illustrations now that I don't think it'll be possible to create another book like manga. But I must say, we live in a much more visual world, so even though it would be much more difficult to get permission to reproduce those images in manga, of course you can go on the web now and you can see an infinite number of images for free, even though they're not may not be legally permitted. One of the ironies of manga, of course, is when I look at it, I'm also reminded of what a different world it was, because I wrote it longhand and then I typed it up on a typewriter because I didn't have a computer, and
sure.
I very few people that I knew, almost no one had computers. They were huge things and cost a ton of money, and I typed it up on paper, and know, when you go into your work today and it says cut and paste or copy, that sort of thing, I actually edited the book myself, literally with a scissor, cutting stuff out and then gluing it on in another place. So it was that's where whenever I look at my word processor and I see the words, cut and paste or copy, I think of that because in the old days, before computers came along, that's how people did a cut and paste, and that's how they did a copy when they were doing real kind of hands-on analog editing. I had my floor completely covered with long strips of paper that were all glued together, and I would rearrange them. Say, maybe this paragraph should go over here, and I'd put it over there on the other side of the room, and then glue it somewhere else. That was the last time I did that. After that, it was all done on a computer of some sort.
Yeah, it's amazing how much technology makes that easier in a lot of ways. Although my mom wrote a novel quite a few years ago, and she still had to print it out every so often after so many drafts and just lay it out. And it's rearranged here. There's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah. Well, it's a very tactile approach, and there are things to be said for a tactile approach. But I must say, I can no longer write that way anymore. Now I revise every sentence, every line I write. I go back and I change it 2 or 3 times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's wonderful in so many ways. So here you were trying to bring manga to a wider audience, and you're working on it on Astro Boy and so forth. Now, how did you get to know Osamu Tezuka himself?
Well, that was in the context of the group that I was a member of Dadakai in Tokyo. Our business manager and the person who was able to initiate these contacts was Shinji Sakamoto. And he was fearless because we were trying to decide, well, what should we start translating? Because there's zillions of works out there, and we love them all, and where to start. And, well, at that time, Tezuka was the most famous person in Japan in terms of manga and even anime, and we were bouncing around ideas, and we thought, well, maybe Phoenix would be a great work to start on, and then we thought, well, who knows, maybe there's some way we could approach and get permission to do so from, if not Tezuka, the people around him. And Sakamoto-san was fearless, and somehow he was able to utilize some old connections and resources he had, and we went, all 4 of us went to Tezuka Productions for an appointment. We had an appointment, as I recall, and I think we wound up meeting Tezuka quite by accident. He happened to be there, and he actually agreed to meet us personally.
Wow.
And he agreed to let us try to translate the Phoenix. And as a group, we did the first 5 volumes. Those are the ones that sat in the safe for 25 years. And my friend Jared and I, we finished the series much later with Viz, working, because it was published ultimately by Viz Media in San Francisco. But that initial meeting with Tezuka was the start of a very long relationship for myself and also for Jerry Cook with Tezuka. And we served as not only sometimes sort of a consultant, but also as his interpreter when he would come to the United States. And I went with Tezuka not only around LA, but I interpreted for him in Florida and also in Canada. And we went around the East Coast to a bunch of universities and locations on the East Coast in Chicago. And I even went to the United Nations.
Really?
Tezuka, and he gave a talk. Yeah, although when I say that, sometimes people misconstrue that, and they think Tezuka actually spoke to the General Assembly at the United Nations, but unfortunately that wasn't true. We spoke in a room in the United Nations, and most of the people in the audience were, of course, local New Yorkers, and many of them were Japanese who were living in New York, and they were families of UN employees or families of businessmen in the area. But Tezuka was able, as a result of that, and the media in Japan was able, as a result of that, to say that Tezuka had spoken at the UN, which is true. He did speak at the UN, and I was there.
What did he talk about?
Tezuka, on these tours, he would give talks, and sometimes he was sponsored by, I believe, the Japan Foundation and the local embassies, as I recall, or the Japanese foreign minister, and he was sort of a emissary, an ambassador, you might say, for Japanese people to the United States, a goodwill ambassador. So he would give talks about Japanese manga and animation. And of course, Americans didn't know anything about it in those days, but Tezuka was great because he was one of the world's fastest artists.
Oh, yeah.
I think Sergei Aragones is also very fast, but Tezuka is definitely one of the fastest people I ever saw. And while he was talking, he could draw. Some people can do this. Stan Sakai can also do this, and he's another hero of mine. But people like that are fabulous as lecturers because while they're thinking and talking, they make these drawings and illustrate everything they're trying to say. And as an interpreter, because I work as a professional interpreter, I have to say Tezuka was fabulous in that regard. He could communicate with that saying, and he was quite a genius at that. So many of the audiences that he spoke to, he would illustrate thoughts about what Japanese comics were like, and the audiences loved it. They really did. And he also came after he created what I think in the United States was titled Space Firebird 2000. Actually, I forget the exact title, but it was the Phoenix, the anime version of the Phoenix that Tezuka created in 1979, 1980. 2772, I think, is the number behind it. So after he created that, he came to the United States, and he showed that in a variety of venues and gave talks related to that. And I also accompanied him for many of those.
Now, I've read of an appearance where Tezuka came over to one of the very early Comic-Cons over here and discovered that nobody had any clue about manga, and I think he said like a year later he sort of got all of the big name mangaka at the time and brought them back to San Diego Comic-Con, and they had like every major name in manga, over there. Were you part of those?
Yeah.
Wow.
Myself and Jared Cook, we were with Tezuka, I believe, both of those times. That was the San Diego, what used to be called the San Diego Comic Convention, Comic-Con. And it's true. I think in the beginning, Tezuka was frustrated in that Americans knew nothing about manga, and the second time he did bring over a lot of prominent manga artists. Whether he brought over all of them, I don't know. I wouldn't say he brought over all of them, but he brought over a lot of those. And Tezuka himself won the Inkpot Award, and shortly thereafter, I think Monkey Punch won the Inkpot Award as well. And it was kind of an opening for Japanese manga artists. But in the beginning, it's true. The San Diego convention was so focused on American comic books that people really didn't know what was being done in Japan at all, and they really didn't know much about, they didn't know anything about Tezuka. But one advantage Tezuka had over all other Japanese manga artists was the fact that several of his works, in animated form at least, had been shown on American TV. So the moment you said Astro Boy or Kimba the White Lion, people's eyes would light up and they said, yes. So he had he had this indirect name recognition, despite the fact that most people who had seen Astro Boy and Kid with the White Line had seen it when they were young, and they had no idea that it was created by somebody named Osamu Tezuka. At least Tezuka could come to the United States and he could say, "Oh, do you know Astro Boy?" And everybody would say, "Oh yeah, we know Astro Boy." And they'd say, "Do you know Kid with the White Line?" I'd say, "Oh, we love Kid with the White Line." So he had this huge advantage over all other Japanese manga artists when he did come here, and that helped him a great deal wherever he went and wherever he spoke. Even if people were not aware of him, there was a way for them to connect.